Welcome also to the second in our series of knowledge exchange seminars on quantitative methods in social media research. I want to go pretty much directly into the program here because our time is limited to just a few hours this afternoon, and you didn't come to hear from me, at least not about introductions. I'm Grant Blank, Survey Research Fellow here at the OII with all kinds of interests in methods, qualitative and quantitative and everything in between. So I think with that as a broad introduction, we're going to follow the outline here in the program that was in your packets today. And so I think the opening session here is on big data, and I'll just turn this over to Ralph and Eric.
Okay, so Eric and I have been working on e-research or on cyber infrastructure, on digital tools and techniques for some time. And I guess one way to indicate our research interest is that we do some of the e-research or some of the research with big data, but more importantly, we kind of look at it from the outside. And I guess that's the perspective that we'll be presenting today, because we have a new project funded by the Sloan Foundation about big data and how it's transforming social science. So that fits, I think, quite nicely with the theme of the workshop. Okay, if we have the... So, this is one of our favorite slides. This is the tail wagging the dog. I think there are a number of different questions that come up with how big data is transforming social science, about ethics, about what kind of techniques you use, about the quality of research, and so on. And we can go into those. But one of the questions that immediately is raised is, you've got lots of different sources of data now. And with that comes immediately the criticism whether the data are driving the research questions. So are people just doing the research because the data are available? Is the tail wagging the dog? And one of the reasons that this is obvious here at the Institute is, for example, that this year, for the first time, we had about 30 master's students this year. They have to do a dissertation. And out of those 30, about 15 dissertations were about Twitter this year. There weren't any last year. So, you know, Twitter has very accessible data. Should you be doing research for the reason that the data is available, or don't you need a research question to start with? And we'll see in a moment that this is kind of a recurring question. Our brief answer that I can preview is that no, that's not what's happening, or at least that's not the key thing that's happening. So with that, if we go to the next slide, one of the things that you need to do in order to address the various questions that we're thinking about is you need to define big data. You don't go anywhere without definitions. And it's very difficult to define big. But Eric and I have been giving us a lot of thought, and obviously there are different places that the big data come from, such as that they weren't collected for social science in the first place. They might come from a supermarket, they might come from Twitter or from social media, where they aren't kind of designed to be answering any social research questions. But that's not the essence of big data, or at least not as far as we're concerned. What I think we would say is that in order to define big, you have to say big in relation to what? And one way to say that is that big data are data that are unprecedented in scale and scope in relation to a given phenomenon. So take the phenomenon that you're interested in, let's say Facebook or Twitter, look at that as a phenomenon, as a social phenomenon, and then ask, are we asking questions in relation to those phenomena that are kind of a step change, a kind of qualitative and quantitative leap in terms of the amount of data that we're using to ask questions or answer questions about that phenomenon. Now, there are lots of philosophical issues here about how you define things and what big means and whether you can identify quantitative and qualitative changes and so on. And one of the things that this definition is it's a little bit relativistic because different phenomena are different size. I mean, if you're talking about the global population, for example, Google has most of the world's search market. So you're talking about the 70 or however many % of the search market that Google has, and you're using data from that, but 70% of the population is of the world's population that uses search engines is very far away from Twitter, which has at the moment how many millions of hundreds of millions of users. So that's again a kind of few hundred million, 400, something like that.
It's around 30%.
Right. So 400 million, let's just say, is different from X billion. But in relation to the given phenomenon, the big data have to be of a kind of scale and scope that is new relative to how phenomena have been investigated in the past. So if this is the question, then what are the different opportunities and challenges in big data? So if we go to the next slide, then we're going to go into some examples in a moment, but one of the things that you can that has been claimed for this area is that the challenges come mainly because, for example, the data are often from private companies, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and they therefore have certain issues, such as that they have different privacy concerns and so on. But also, I mean, you could ask Google, could you please give me your data about who's searching for what? Can I ask you please to have that? And can't we have it as a body of data that researchers could use and that could be, transparently used by everyone in the same way? And I can tell you that you're not going to get it, right? Still, you have papers that are based on Google data, and they're very powerful. We'll see an example of that in a moment. So that's one thing that's said about this area. Now, the other thing that we're going to be talking about, though, is that these are serious issues. But then there's another kind of meta issue, which we think is possibly coming onto the horizon and possibly kind of outweighs all these other issues, which is that in the past, social scientists have been rather data poor. And we're also going to make the argument that, in social sciences, as every one of you knows, in quantitative, qualitative, and so on, these debates go on and on and on. One of the things that's going to happen with big data is that, in a certain sense, social science is going to become more scientistic or more mathematical. And it's going to become, therefore, we would argue, more powerful. And if that happens, then one of the things that's going to happen is that people are going to get afraid of us, of social scientists, be afraid, very afraid. And that's new, because social scientists have been kind of weaklings in the past. We haven't been able to manipulate the environment which we study very powerful. Companies can do that. Facebook knows, and Google knows what you're doing. But those companies have different aims, or the government, when it exercises censuses and surveys and so on, knows what you're up to in a certain respect. And we've had debates in the past about what that means for the public that is being subjected, if you like, to big data. But in social science, we haven't had that. On the one hand, so we think that this threatening nature of social science is coming onto the horizon. Having said that, we would argue there's very little to worry about, because social scientists are interested, and this will be contentious, we're interested in pure knowledge. We're not interested in manipulating people into buying things, into, let's say, losing weight by having a government health promotion via Facebook or something like that. We social scientists have a different aim, and our aim is advancing knowledge. And so there's, and that doesn't actually manipulate people, and so there are these different, there are gray areas here, but the interesting thing for us is that big data means that social science is becoming more scientific, is becoming more powerful, is more penetrating, if you like, and at the same time, the worries about the threats of big data are somewhat misplaced. With that, we can go on to the next slide and go into some of the philosophical reasons why this scientific nature of big data is driving social science forward. And I'm not going to kind of go into this in detail, we've argued this before, but I think the interesting thing about mathematizing or scientizing social science by using big data, the interesting thing that's going on here is that unlike in other areas of social science, where let's say in interpretivist, culturalist areas of social science, where people are always going to disagree, one of the things that happens here, and the reason that science is kind of driven forward, is that people are using technologies for manipulating numbers. And this is what lies at bottom at why science is progressing in the first place. That many people can look at numbers, they can agree on what those symbols mean, and that they focus their efforts on those numbers, and then that they can drive a certain research agenda forward, given that that's going to be more cumulative in a certain sense than other areas of social science. It all sounds very abstract, but think about, for example, Facebook. You've got certain networks, people analyze those networks, they identify a certain mathematical network structure, they agree in relation to the numbers what that network structure is, and whoever is going to analyze those data and arrive at more powerful data is going to have to do better. That is to say, do the math or mathematically model those relationships better, and that's a reason for advance in this area as opposed to other areas. There's a whole kind of background sociology of science here about why mathematics drives science in the first place, but we can go into that in the discussion. So let's look at some, this is a very highbrow, if you like, discussion. Let's look at some very concrete example. Let's look at search engine behavior. And search engine behavior, in a way, I should say parenthetically that search engine behavior seems a million miles from social media. But Eric and I just attended a talk, what was it, on Monday? The Twitter talk? Or was it Monday? Where the person was talking about search in Twitter and how they analyze search in Twitter. And that's also a social relationship. So search is also obviously can be seen as kind of social media behavior, if you like. In any case, let's look at the challenges of using or of analyzing search data, which illustrates some of these points that I've made. So, I'm drawing here on an article by Waller in the journal JSIST, which is a very prestigious journal in library and information science, where she has analyzed Australian Google users. In Australia, Google has more than 90% of the search market, and what Waller can do, because she's had access to the company Hitwise Experian, which is a kind of marketing company, she knows which Australians over a considerable amount of time searched for what. Now, if you think about this if you zoom out and think about what this means that for this given phenomenon, remember the definition of big data, for this given phenomenon, we actually now have a kind of microscope in which we can look at what Australians want to know on a very large scale for a very large population and analyze mathematically the content of what they know. Notice that this in the background here are all those threats to, that social science poses here, because one of the things that we don't like as kind of citizens is other people to know what we know, right? But anyway, that's by the by. Now, not only does she know what Australians searched for, and she can do large-scale analysis of that, Waller that is, but she also knows who searched for what, right? Because she's got data from Hitwise Experian, which is broken down into different social classes, not social class in the kind of sociological sense, but social class. Hitwise Experian uses these things like, silver surfers who are retirees who live on the coast in Australia, and then they've got kind of the urban nomads and these kind of classes, but they're broadly comparable to sociological classes. So she can analyze not just what Australians want to know, but who wants to know what, which is quite a powerful thing. And the results are striking. In fact, they're so striking that I don't entirely believe them. And every time I present this to other people, you're very welcome to look at the article yourselves. I think this is impossible. Because the main finding is that there is no perceptible difference in what Australians search for among these different social classes. So rich, poor, male, female, what have you, everyone wants to know the same thing. This is pretty striking, but she's able to document this. The other thing is that less than 2% of Australian searches are for things that we normally consider searching for information, right? Searching for health information, for government information. The vast bulk of it, well, half of it is just navigational search, people being too lazy to go to the website directly. So if they want to go to Facebook or if they want to go to the New York Times, they Google New York Times or Facebook. They're just using search as a kind of tool to get there. But less than 10% is what we would call searching for information, and the vast bulk is for leisure. Britney Spears, or where can I find antique furniture and what have you. So that's the vast bulk of search. Now, in relation to the kind of framework that we presented in a moment ago, this is novel, this is big data in the sense that you have unprecedented insight into what people search for. Right? We didn't have this kind of thing before, at least on this scale and scope. The challenge here, the challenges are multiple. One is that you can't replicate this because we don't, as other social scientists, we don't have access to this. So among the issues are the replicability of these findings. But they're mathematically there, and they will be somehow scientifically challenged and advanced upon, as we put it. Second example is, again, not from social media, but from something that's fairly close to it, which is Google Books. And here there are a couple of articles that we look at. One is the culturomic analysis. I'm sure people have heard about this. How many people have heard about culturomics and this large-scale analysis of Google Books? So a couple of people, but in any case, what they did is they looked at 5 million digitized Google Books. And they have lots of interesting findings, but what we decided to do is to look more closely at an article which doesn't use the Google Books data, but which uses a similar data set of 2,779 19th century novels. The analysis is done by Heuser and Lacock. Incidentally, all the references, I think, are at the end. So now, if you analyze very, very large-scale text, then you can find new things. So, for example, they found that for the 19th century, there are certain key terms which tell them that in this body of 2,779 19th century British novels, there was a shift from more abstract to concrete words. And what they argue on the basis of a kind of English literature analysis is that this implies that you can make certain claims about when industrialization had what effect in the 19th century, as mirrored through novels. So, in this case, unlike the previous case, there is replicability as long as you can have the tools to analyze 2,779 novels and their texts. And you can also, and this is the kind of argument that we were making about advance, what this is going to lead to and is already leading to, including the analysis of digitized Google Books, what you do is you say, okay, we've done these 5 million and we've looked at these key terms, now let's look at those key terms. Or we've looked at 3,000 19th century British novels, now let's look at a few thousand German 19th century novels, or and so what you're looking at is not necessarily the fine-grained interpretation of those texts, but you're looking at the mathematics that everybody can focus on, can agree on, and the patterns that are found thereby. The challenges here, and of course once this happens in English literature, as you can imagine, what this happens when, for example, computer scientists, like these people who analyzed 5 million books rather than Heuser and Lacock, who are kind of literary scholars, when this happens, when computer scientists analyze literature, is that humanities scholars say, oh my God, you can't do this, you know, what does this all mean? You've got all these texts. This is not, you can't make the claims that you claim on the basis of this analysis of words, because words are meaningful and. But, and there are these kind of debates going on. And again, we've got some references for people who criticize this kind of work. But that will be ongoing, because humanities will always kind of need to have an engagement with and against more scientific ways of understanding humanities. So people have challenged the data quality, and there are some very serious issues with the data in 5 million Google books and in the Heuser and Lacock analysis. So final example, this is just from the article. This is where you look at terms like slavery from 1800 to 2000, for example, and their prevalence over 5 million books. And you can make certain conclusions from that. I won't go into that for purposes of time. Let's look at Twitter, which is obviously a social medium. And there are a number of really interesting studies. In fact, one of the master's theses that I mentioned earlier was an analysis of 400 social science papers, or social science relevant papers that have been published relevant to the analysis of Twitter, which is quite amazing if you think about it, because Twitter is, 3 years old, and there are already 400 papers. So this is a kind of exploding field. But one interesting paper that I can just focus on, but there are many others that you could take here, is Quack et al. And they looked at what they call 1.4 billion social relations in Twitter, by which they mean some kind of links between different tweets. Now, there are many interesting detailed findings that they have. You can look at who the top people who are being followed, or people or institutions such as New York Times, CNN, Obama, against celebrities, Justin Bieber, Ashton Kutcher, and so on. All these are in the top 20, so you can see who's being followed. But you can also look at the distribution of how few people are really being followed, as opposed to the many who aren't being followed. And 2/3 of users are not followers or not followed by any of their followings, right? Which tells you something about Twitter as a whole. So, again, opportunities and challenges. Opportunities, this is big data, this is novel relationships. I'm not sure how many other social scientists can claim to have looked at 1.47 billion social relationships. Relationships, note, not just individuals, but relationships. But, so that's a step change, right? It fits our definition of big data. But there are challenges. What on earth is Twitter? Is it broadcast, or is it a social network like Facebook? And that's something which this paper explicitly addresses, but which we would argue you can't really address in the abstract. That is to say, you can't answer whether Twitter, what kind of medium or what kind of network Twitter is, unless you can compare it to something else. Otherwise, you're not going anywhere. And that is going to continue, I think, to be a major question for Twitter. What is it? What kind of animal is it? Is it an elephant or a tiger? Is it a social network, or is it a broadcast medium? And how much of each? Because it's clearly could be said to be both. Or it could be some other animal altogether. And the other challenge, of course, is securing access to commercial data. There are some people who have vast Twitter corpora. There are other people who have to pay for it. There are companies that pay for the whole thing. So that's going to be an issue in Twitter research for quite some time. So, conclusions. There are some there are some well-cited articles about big data in the social sciences. Savage and Burroughs wrote something called The Empirical Crisis of Sociology, where basically their argument is commercial companies are going to be able to do better than social scientists what social scientists should be doing. So, we're being outpaced by the commercial world because they have better data. Or there are these 6 provocations by Dana Boyd and Kate Crawford, who raise all sorts of difficult epistemological issues about what is knowledge and how valid is knowledge and so on. What Meyer and Schroeder say, in contrast, or in an article that we haven't published yet, but we kind of say, okay, that's fine, what these points that you're making. But we're making quite a different point, which is that, or we're making several points. One is that no matter what Boyd and Crawford may say about epistemology, it has been the case for all of modern science, since the birth of modern science, that technologies drive knowledge. The microscope, the telescope, the voltmeter, these tools have always driven knowledge, and what's more is mathematization has driven knowledge, simply because it's an abstract symbolic language which people can kind of focus on. There's a whole kind of sociology here which allows you to say under what conditions knowledge progresses and under what conditions knowledge doesn't. Notice, by the way, that I don't say that valid knowledge is good, a good thing or a bad thing. As a social scientist, I'm completely neutral about that. By progressing, I simply mean that knowledge moves forward more rapidly. So that's one thing we say. The other thing, therefore, is that we need to think about, if we have this greater progressing, we need to think about what it means primarily to have insights into what people think and do online that we didn't have beforehand, because that may upset people. I mean, we don't really know very much about this, but there's considerable anecdotal evidence, or you very often hear in the newspapers nowadays things like, I didn't want Google to know what I was searching for and therefore making a recommendation that I wanted this thing as well. Or I didn't want Facebook to know that I was connected to so-and-so and therefore suggesting this product to me. Well, we as social scientists aren't going to do that, but we're going to do something similar. And we want to be aware of where the limits of our knowledge are, as opposed to what a commercial company or a government agency may be wanting to do with knowledge. And finally, the point we would make is, or the point that we would raise is, so what are the kind of validity issues here? What are the issues for us as practicing social scientists for the kind of strengths and weaknesses about the claims that we make towards a more kind of scientific or social scientific knowledge? Because this, again, is going to be raised, be much more forefronted in the big era of big data than what we've had before. I mean, in other words, this is going to become a kind of issue around which there are critical debates. And I think that's all we wanted to say. Oh, and this is how we propose to look at it. So in our project, what we're going to be doing is looking at big data and social sciences. And we have this kind of matrix here. Some data are public. Some data are private. Some are open and some are closed. And with closed, for example, you can think of, well, closed and private, you see the different agencies that are, and companies that are involved here. So where do we locate ourselves as social scientists? And where are these points of translations between these different types? Because they're obviously not pure types. But these are things to think about, whether we have access to the data because of replicability issues, because of cost issues, and so on. All these issues are going to be raised against the background of what we've been saying. And I think that's it. Eric, you want to add anything?
Nope.
Okay.
We're taking too long.
Sorry.